Hello and welcome into another episode of the Fantasy Football Forecast. I'm your host, Trevor Scott, joined by my co-host, Matt Giraldi.
What's going on, guys?
And we are back on the mic together. This is going to be great. We're getting into the week 4 quarterback rankings. And so we're going to go 1 through 32 here. Obviously from a SuperFlex perspective. So we're going to be talking about some of the guys that we like. Again, we're going to stick with that theme of like 12 to 25, kind of making roster decisions in that range is going to be the difficult part of this week. And there's been a lot of shakeup in that range of quarterbacks. So they're definitely going to be starting guys moving forward, and especially this week, that you probably drafted a little bit lower than you would have liked to admit. So without further ado, let's get into it.
So starting right at the top, we've got Josh Allen. He is at Baltimore this week. He is QB1 on the season, coming off a 30-point game against Jacksonville. Baltimore's actually given up the most pass yards through the air, so I would expect them to maybe lean on Allen a little bit more as a thrower in this game. But you and I have been talking about this game quite a bit. Very excited for this one.
Game of the week, baby. This is going to be great. It's on Sunday night, too, so this is going to be an excellent game. Tune in even just as an NFL fan to this game. It's going to be great. Number 2, we got Kyler Murray. He had a down week last week, and they lost the game, and he honestly did not look good, which was surprising after how good he looked in the first 2 weeks. But there's no better medicine than getting a matchup against the Commanders, who are terrible against the pass, and so we're going to go ahead and push him right back up into this number 2 spot. I have him at 2, you have him at 3, and I initially had him at 1 when I was doing my rankings before we watched Josh Allen on Monday night, but watching him just explode and have 4 touchdowns in the first half, over 200 yards, it's just undeniable with Josh Allen. Like you said, Baltimore's very vulnerable through the air, so that might even push more pass attempts, and if Baltimore can kind of keep Josh Allen racking up points throughout the game.
Number 3, back to the game I originally talked about, we've got Lamar against the Buffalo Bills. They're coming off a great road win against Dallas where he only had to throw the ball 15 times and still put up 25 fantasy points. He showed he can be productive in a low-volume passing game. He's also showed that he can be productive in a high-volume passing week. Going back to week 1, he threw it 41 times against the Chiefs. Bills are a tough defense, and they are at home. But again, it's Lamar Jackson versus Josh Allen, so should be a shootout.
Yeah, and if you've got Lamar, you're obviously very happy through the first couple weeks here, 25, 17, and 25. We did talk in the preseason about Lamar possibly putting up those stinger games when they get way up, but that just has not been the case, and there has been no worse team in the NFL than the Ravens with a double-digit lead. So I do think maybe the offense kind of continues to try and keep it going here a little bit to help their defense out as they get later into games here. So I do think even those blowout game scripts, Lamar should be staying in the game, and they should be continuing to try and establish the offense and, maybe establish him a little bit more as a passer too, because like they need to stop giving up these major leads that they get. So, just running it into the line a bunch of times with Henry, I don't think is the move. So, they got to try and keep their offense working, and I think that's an adjustment they're going to make. Going down to number 4, Jaden Daniels. So this one was somebody that we warned about, that we left at QB 10, and we said if he had a bad game, he's probably going to plummet. If he had a good game, he'll probably get pushed up. And against the Bengals, I know they have a bad defense, but man, did he have his coming out game through the air. 21 of 23, 250 yards and 2 touchdowns, deep balls to McLaurin. So that whole completion close to the line of scrimmage, completely out the window. He looked excellent throwing the ball down the field. It was honestly incredible to watch. I do think Noah Brown still getting more involved in the offense. He had a red zone target where he almost scored. So maybe they have a little bit more juice on that second outside receiver. Luke McCaffrey finally had a decent game too. He had 7.5 points, but he caught a 30-yard pass down to the 1-yard line. He looked like he was kind of starting to get a little bit more involved. And honestly, that's really all Daniels needs, right? It's just a little bit of production from these other guys down the field to McLaurin. And obviously his legs are going to be what kind of carries him to this high-end production, 40 yards and a touchdown again on the ground. Against a bad Arizona defense, or maybe not necessarily a bad defense, but a team that should be able to kind of rack up the points on them. So they'll have to continue to keep up against Arizona. Really like Jaden Daniels this week. And I do think the main reason to push him up this high is the breakout that he had passing the ball.
Yeah, and I'll take my medicine on Daniels a little bit. I was not high on him in the offseason and the draft process, but now, given with how he looked last week, it's really hard to deny that. And he could have been even better. He missed McLaurin on that one deep shot where, credit to Terry being a professional. He didn't get frustrated. He went right back to the line of scrimmage and he ended up getting fed. after that. So assuming that rapport continues to build, we could be looking at a really good season out of Jaden Daniels. Moving over to number 5, we've got Joe Burrow. Bengals are 0-3, coming off a disappointing loss against the Commanders, but Burrow had a great game. He threw for 324 yards, 3 touchdowns. Chase looks like he's back to his old self. Higgins was out there. Yoshi Voss is looking like a solid number 3. They've got Carolina this week, who is not very good, but Carolina looked a lot better offensively last week after they moved over to Andy Dalton. So Cincinnati's defense is not good by any stretch of the imagination. So there is a scenario in which this game kind of turns into a shootout. So very excited about Burrow.
Yeah, and going down to number 6, Dak. He was the QB1 last week. Looked awesome, and honestly, he looked good in the fourth quarter. They were down big, right? They were down 28-6 in the fourth quarter, and he was able to kind of air it out. And they got an onside kick, so that additionally fueled his production. So even though they kind of got back into the game, it did feel a little bit like garbage time points here. And against the Giants, I do think that they're going to be able to be winning against the Giants. So maybe they get out to a big lead. But I think the reason I struggled with this ranking, because you put him all the way up at 4, and I have him at 7. So our consensus was 6 between the two of us. So I just wasn't able to push him up any higher than that, just because I do think the game script is going to be a little bit more geared towards trying to hang on to the lead instead of trying to catch up. So that's where we're at with Dak. Obviously, if you have him set and forget start.
Yeah, and I think the reason I pushed him up a little bit more is just looking back at the 2 games they played against the Giants last year. The Cowboys put up 40 and 49 points against them. They have their number, and Dallas loves to run up a big score when they can. So I'm just kind of looking at the upside here against kind of a hapless Giants team.
I think there might be a little bit of a squeaky wheel game coming for CeeDee Lamb too. I don't know if you guys watching saw CeeDee Lamb and Dak kind of get into it on the sideline a little bit. So, maybe they try and feed CeeDee Lamb early, and this true breakout game from CeeDee Lamb after his holdout is around the corner this week.
Moving over to number 7, we've got CJ Stroud facing off against Jacksonville. So tough game for Stroud last week, getting blown out by Minnesota. Didn't really see that one coming, but Minnesota's defense is kind of a force to be reckoned with. But they get Jacksonville at home this week, which should be a get-right game. Jacksonville is in shambles right now, both offensively and defensively. We saw what Josh Allen did to them on Monday night. I think if Joe Mixon mixes another game, they'll let Stroud throw it all over the yard, and we could be looking at like a 300-plus yard, 3-touchdown game to get CJ back on track.
Going down to number 8, this is going to be lower than you're going to see him pretty much anywhere else, is Jalen Hurts against Tampa Bay. I do expect A.J. Brown to miss this game, and I think Devonta Smith is going to take it down all the way till game time. He took a pretty nasty hit and is in the concussion protocol. So maybe he gets right and available. But if both of those guys miss, Hurts is just not going to be able to produce in the air. So maybe he gets it going on the ground and can get like 70 and a touchdown on the ground or 2 and really push up into the top 5. But the reason we have him down at 8 is because of that passing game cap with missing both his receivers here.
Yeah, and I think with how good Saquon has looked on the ground, this is going to be a game where they continue to feed him too. So like you said, with if the rushing is there, then yes, we know his ceiling, but if it's not there, I mean, he has not really necessarily looked that great as a passer. And if he's missing 1 or 2 of his top weapons, then I'd be inclined to maybe even move this down a little bit lower. Moving on to number 9, we've got Patrick Mahomes facing off against the Chargers. We talked about Mahomes a couple times as a trade target for SuperFlex players. I think that's still in play. If you haven't checked out our trade targets video, go ahead and look into that. If Mahomes is someone that you've got your eye on, he's currently QB 13 on the season. And while they've won every game and he's been consistent, he hasn't eclipsed 17 points yet. We're not 100% sure if Justin Herbert's going to play in this game. We are, at this point, forecasting that he is going to miss the game. So we could see a situation in which that Mahomes doesn't necessarily have to throw the ball a whole lot. Maybe they ride the running game, but I would still pencil him in for a couple touchdowns against their division rival.
Yeah, and with Mahomes, too, been very disappointing. So if you can get him, go try and do that in your SuperFlex leagues. Just a quick plug here. If you do want to see our full rankings, right, this is obviously our quarterbacks. If you want to see our running backs, receivers, and tight ends, comment down below asking for our rankings, and we will send you a link to our rankings. Getting into number 10, we've got Sam Darnold. This is pushed up very high, but he's justified it so far. He's been a top 5 quarterback so far this year. He leads the league in passing touchdowns, and he's been doing it down playmakers, right? Obviously, we've been saying it constantly, down Hawkinson, down Jordan Addison, and he still is just producing like there's no issue with it at all. Had 4 touchdowns to 4 different receivers this past week. And so going up against division rival Green Bay, we do expect Jordan Love to be back in this game. Can maybe do a little bit more against this defense than other teams have been able to so far. But Darnold is going to be locked in as the foundational piece of this passing offense and has been able to facilitate the offense extremely productively. So if you have Darnold, go ahead and get him in your lineups this week.
Yeah, I think Kevin O'Connell's got to be the front runner for Coach of the Year at this point. What he's doing with this offense and this team is pretty impressive, and it's great to see Darnold kind of bounce back, and hopefully he can continue to keep this going. Number 11, Andy Dalton. So this is probably the highest that you're going to see Andy Dalton ranked. I mean, we had him ranked at QB 20 last week, which was definitely higher than consensus, but turns out probably wasn't high enough. We spent a lot of time during the offseason talking about how Dave Canales is this QB whisperer who loves to resurrect careers. And while we were following that narrative towards Bryce Young, maybe the answer was Andy Dalton the whole time. So Dalton was definitely Canales' guy in the preseason, but I'm assuming David Tepper probably told him that he had to start young because that's what you do when you're the worst owner in the league. Last week, Dalton went off for 319 yards and 3 touchdowns. He gets Cincinnati this week at home, and Cincinnati is not a good defense at all. We saw what Jaden Daniels did on Monday night. Panthers are a bad defense in their own right. So like we mentioned with Joe Burrow, this has the makings of what could be a shootout. So I feel pretty comfortable with this ranking, and I'm starting him in our SuperFlex league.
Yeah, if you were able to pick him up in SuperFlex anywhere, you are definitely starting him this week. It's just too good of a spot. And honestly, we have him at 11, and I ranked him at 13. You had him at 10, and I kind of felt like just pushing him all the way up to next to Dak. That's kind of how I feel about him. Obviously, some of these guys are much more established, but the way that Carolina is going to be passing and the way that they're going to just give up points to Cincinnati just feels, again, like this game's going to be a shootout. We mentioned it with Burrow. Going down to number 12, we have Jordan Love coming off that knee injury, and I do expect him to play. He got a limited practice on Friday, but ultimately got held out this week. They're expecting him to practice come Wednesday, and obviously going to be limited reps just as they manage his workload, but I do think he's going to be out there. Against Minnesota, I would like to have had him higher, right? I mean, I put him at 10. I would have liked to have him up again around Dak, but against this Minnesota defense coming off an injury, I just think that this spot maybe is a little bit difficult for him. But again, the playmakers are awesome. Jaden Reed maybe can be a needle turner in this matchup for Love's production. And so I do still like Love. If you have him and if you've been sitting on him, you've likely missed out on adding other quarterbacks, or you added Malik Willis, and so you didn't get in on Dalton per se. So I do think Love you're going back to this week.
Yeah, and I had him at 14 just because we saw what Minnesota did to CJ Stroud. But hopefully Love does come back. Hopefully he continues to look healthy, because I know we talked about it that Malik Willis couldn't knock off any wins for the Packers, but that's hasn't really been the case, which is a credit to their coaching staff as well.
So good.
But yeah, hopefully he's back out there to get guys like Jaden Reed going. Maybe Christian Watson gets more involved. We know he loves Romeo Doubs, and we can really see this Packers offense firing on all cylinders, because this could turn out to be, one of the games of the week. Moving over to number 13, we've got Brock Purdy versus the New England Patriots. So Purdy's coming off a fantastic game from a fantasy perspective, throwing for 292 yards, 3 touchdowns, but obviously it was a disappointing loss for the 49ers. They kind of blew that game. I know the Rams kind of took it from them, but yeah, it was a tough L for Niners fans.
Stafford is so good at real football. Obviously, we have him ranked really low, but he is just awesome as a real life quarterback. I mean, he almost pulled out with that week 1 win, and then pulled out this win against the 49ers. So
yeah, he was kind of in his old Detroit form, right, where his team stunk and he had to do everything by himself. Well, with Calvin Johnson too, but you know what I mean. It's just so impressive to watch. And we talked about that game in the preview, saying, this was going to be a real test of Sean McVay's coaching and creativity, and he passed that test with flying colors. But yeah, with this matchup against New England, I don't really expect the Patriots to be able to stay on the field a whole lot. I know they have what people always think is a really solid defense, but if you're not able to stay on the field as an offense, eventually, they're going to wear down.
Number 14 here, we have Caleb Williams. And this is tied significantly to the matchup. Obviously, he had a kind of a breakout game from a fantasy perspective, right? He ended up with 17 points, but that was because he turned the ball over 3 times. So that really was a drain on his upside overall. I do think that if he can clean it up in this game against a very gettable Rams defense, they have just been terrible against the pass this year. And Caleb looked great. I think Odunze kind of had a breakout game last week as well. So hopefully that connection is going to help elevate Caleb's floor. DJ Moore obviously is there. He did get a lot of his production from that Hail Mary he caught at the end of the first half on the 1 yard line. But overall, I think the offense should be very good. If Keenan Allen sits, we've seen Cole Kmet kind of step up into that near the line of scrimmage role, and their running game just is non-existent. So I do think overall that this is going to fall a lot on Caleb's shoulders. I have Caleb in a league where I'm probably going to be playing him over Jared Goff. So I still have to kind of sit with that decision for a while, and I have to wear the fact that sleepers projections are not going to catch up to where I think they should be, so I have to wear the 3-point loss on the projections. But overall, I think Caleb is in for a big week.
Yeah, and you didn't even mention Rome Odunze's come out party, so that was great to see him get more involved. Oh, you did? Okay, sorry, I must have been spacing out there. I figured he would because he was on your bench putting up a lot of points in our matchup this week. But yeah, we talked about last week how he was just dumping it off to no-name receivers, and we're like, why aren't you getting your top players involved more? So it was really good to see, and I do still expect Caleb to start running a little bit more. I mean, we saw that a lot in college. With how bad their running backs have been, like maybe he starts to do that a little bit more. I know they want to protect their investment, so I wouldn't expect a whole bunch of designed runs, but maybe on some of those scrambles where he tries to, fling it to the sideline, maybe he takes off and runs a little bit more. So I think he's someone who's definitely ascending. Moving on to number 15, we've got Baker. Baker came back down to earth a little bit last week against a good Broncos pass defense. He's facing off against Philly this week. We're in the middle of the road against the pass. We know Baker's got great weapons. He isn't afraid to air it out. So we are hoping for a bounce back week from him. Being a little bit cautious because he is the number 5 QB on the season, but hopefully he gets right against the Eagles.
Yeah, and the Eagles are very gettable in the secondary. I do think Philly's going to struggle to score a little bit. So maybe their defense is tightening up a little bit because they kind of limited Carr last week. But I do think that this is going to be a get-right week for Mike Evans, too, because he's been kind of bad through the last 2 weeks. So I think Baker gets him more involved. Godwin's obviously been phenomenal. He's been a top 5 wide receiver so far. So I think getting Evans going is going to help Baker this week. At number 16, Anthony Richardson. This one is painful, obviously, to rank him this low, but I think it's a combination of the fact that he's been terrible through 2 weeks. Jonathan Taylor is taking so much of the rushing work and all of the rushing work close, so he's getting all of the touchdowns on the ground so far, and this is a very difficult matchup against Pittsburgh. So those 3 things kind of working together, I think, is what pushes him down for this week specifically. If you have Anthony Richardson, do not turn this off, please, because we have him at 16. Just know that we do, or I do anyways, intend on pushing him back up once he has a better matchup and once we kind of see him get going on the ground. I think the Steichen offense has been kind of limping out of the gate here. They haven't really figured out their identity, figured out what they want to do. Outside of just giving the ball to Jonathan Taylor, which is really the only thing that's been working so far. So hopefully he kind of gets it going through the air this week. We see, light at the end of the tunnel in terms of that for Richardson, and we can push him back up into the top 10 on a weekly basis.
Yeah, I think Steichen's going to have to kind of take a long look in the mirror, but I think he is a good offensive coach, and I think he will find a way to turn this around. Getting Richardson some more design runs, maybe some zone reads, and then starting to hit, the easy layups with Josh Downs, then that he's back and healthy, and some of his, very talented receivers. So we talked about this last week. He is going to be probably the hardest guy to rank going forward for quarterbacks, just because he has a sky-high ceiling and a very low floor. But I think against Pittsburgh, it's just a very tough matchup. And a guy going on at number 17 who we were pretty far off on, and I know I pushed him higher than I probably should have, and I'll probably adjust that as the week goes on, but I've got Deshaun Watson facing off against the Raiders. Deshaun Watson has not looked good. I still think he'll be benched sooner than later. We've talked about this quite a bit. But this is a great matchup against Las Vegas. He's averaging 28 yards per game on the ground, which helps his floor. Vegas has him throwing for over 200 yards in this one. We saw the Panthers last week against Vegas look like one of the best teams in the league. So I'm just saying if Watson can not take as many stacks, still throw for a couple touchdowns and run a little bit, I think he has a decent ceiling in this game, but this one feels a little bit gross.
Yeah, this was definitely the biggest separation we had because I had Watson at 21 and you had him at 11. So we basically split the difference here with this ranking. But overall, I don't think Watson is just very good, right? I mean, hopefully Amari Cooper gets healthy and is able to kind of be a big part of the game plan here. I don't think Njoku's going to play, so he's going to have that to contend with. And so, maybe he finds his way into a rushing touchdown and that kind of salvages his day and pushes him to the top 15. Other than that, I don't think he's going to be very productive. Going down to number 18 is Geno Smith. This is somebody that I had higher than Watson for sure, and somebody I would definitely play over Watson, especially in a game against Detroit where I think that the scoring could get run up here a little bit. Detroit's been like a little bit of a weird team to kind of project against because they've played some low scoring games, even though they've had like a high pass attempt game and a low pass attempt game. They're kind of scoring roughly the same amount of points, but I hope that this game can get to be a little bit higher scoring. I think Geno and DK Metcalf have kind of elevated the floor for both those guys because they have hit on deep touchdowns. They look to have pretty good rapport. And Jackson Smith-Njigba, I think, even after having a down week 3, is still on the field a ton and is still running a ton of routes and getting a lot of targets. So I expect him to have a bounce back against Detroit here, and that will only help Geno coming off a disappointing week 3.
Yeah, Detroit, they're kind of bizarre. Like you said, their secondary's been good and a lot better than last year, but they've also given up like a bunch of explosive plays. So I think that goes back into what you were saying with DK Metcalf. Like maybe he can get loose for one. But yeah, I'm very excited for this game. Number 19, Jared Goff, the guy that you said you might be sitting in favor of Caleb Williams. Solid game last week against the Cardinals, finished up with only 14 points, but they won the game. He was only asked to throw the ball 23 times. He's facing off against the undefeated Seahawks in what should be a great game. Seahawks have the number 1 pass defense, which is why they brought in Mike McDonald. So would expect a heavy dose of rushing from Gibbs and Monty.
Number 20, we have Justin Fields at Indianapolis. This is going to be as low as you're going to see Fields ranked probably. He did look much better as a passer last week, and we obviously know he's got all kinds of rushing upside. So in this game against Indy, where Indy's offense doesn't look that great, it's probably going to be low scoring. Fields could see a bigger role on the ground. Also, Jaylen Warren is week to week with an injury too, so maybe Cordell Patterson kind of takes on that role, but also Fields could see an increase in rushing because they're not going to have that second option in Warren on the field. So they're going to lose a little bit of explosiveness on the ground that Fields could kind of help bridge the gap for. Overall, I don't know that this is going to be very high scoring. I do think this is going to be a heavy Najee Harris game and that this could turn into a 13-10 game. That's why I ranked Fields lower than maybe you'll see it on other sites. But I do think if he does hit a couple long touchdowns, the Calvin Austin one was kind of a fluke play, right? I mean, how often is he going to hit Calvin Austin for a 60-yard touchdown or whatever it was? So, I do hope to see him, if there is a big play in this game, that it goes to Pickens. And overall, I think Fields is just going to be a low-scoring affair here.
Number 21, Derek Carr. So Carr, alongside with Baker, also kind of came down to earth again last week against the Eagles. They're on the road against Atlanta this week. Atlanta's a pretty neutral matchup defensively. I think the bottom line is 6 targets for Chris Olave just isn't enough. He kind of got him going early in the game, and they looked to be in a really good rhythm. Kind of got away from it until later in the game. Obviously, Olave had scored that touchdown, but he's clearly the top receiver on their team. He probably would have had a better game, obviously, if Rashid Shaheed would have connected on that long touchdown. Maybe he gets a couple deep balls from Carr this week. So expect a decent bounce back from him, but I don't think we're going to see those crazy spike weeks that we saw in weeks 1 and 2.
Yeah, agreed there. Number 22, we have Daniel Jones. This one is as surprising to me as it is to you guys probably. We are also split by 10 spots on Daniel Jones. I had him at 17. Matt had him at 27. So I do think that Daniel Jones has looked much better with a legitimate number 1 wide receiver, and Malik Neighbors is just not guardable. So I think that helps elevate his floor, and he still can run. And they just played Cleveland, who's like a really difficult defense to play against. And Dallas has been terrible on defense so far. So maybe there's a little bit of a low scoring element to this game, more so than I would like. But I do think that Daniel Jones, with that new weapon, is in a better position to succeed. And also Devin Singletary on the ground and in the passing game has helped kind of elevate his floor as well. Had 40 yards in the receiving game, kind of helping out Jones get some easy targets, easy yards to the running back position as well. Not to say that he hasn't had that in the past, obviously with Saquon Barkley, right? But the fact that he's not losing that element to the game while also being elevated in such a major way by Malik Neighbors is why I pushed Daniel Jones up here, even in a difficult matchup against Dallas. And I would play him over quite a few of these guys here, right? I mean, everybody below him, I would play Daniel Jones ahead of. And I know in our main league, the team member who has Daniel Jones is likely going to lose Herbert here to that high ankle sprain for a little bit. So Jones will be in his start.
Number 23, Aaron Rodgers. He's facing off against Denver this week at home. Rodgers has looked good so far this year. He's definitely passed the eye test. It's so fun watching him carve up a defense. It's just like poetry in motion. Broncos are the number 2 pass defense and are bottom 3rd in rush defense. So would expect a heavy dose of Breece Hall and Braden Allen this week. We know that Garrett Wilson's going to be getting Pat Surtain facing off against him. So I think would not expect a whole lot from him. I know I'm going to be pushing him down our wide receiver rankings quite a bit, unfortunately. But Lazard's look good. Conklin's look good. Mike Williams might get mixed in a little bit more. So don't expect a high upside out of Rodgers, but I think, could be a decent start if you need him.
Starter in 12-team leagues that we're going to be diving deeper into here is Will Levis against Miami. I think this has a lot to do with the matchup here, and it should be a winnable game. This is very critical for Will Levis. There's been starting to be rumblings about trying to figure out how to move on from him already, even only after 11 career starts and 3 starts this year. But against Miami, this offense for Miami without Tua is just not good. So hopefully Tennessee can kind of hold them down a little bit and Levis can get it going in the air to Calvin Ridley. Hopefully they have a little bit more creative ways to get him open this week. And Hopkins looked great in his limited snaps last week. So hopefully that'll help out Levis and he'll be able to win this game and look good through the air doing it, limit the turnovers. I know he had a bunch of turnovers last week, so hopefully no more pick sixes and he can kind of guide this offense to a win here at 24.
Yeah, I mean, that's
sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, it's kind of what we, have been talking about all along with Will Levis, right? He's going to throw some deep bombs. He's going to have some decent games, and then he's going to turn it over and look horrible sometimes. But I think hopefully Tennessee's able to establish the run a little bit more in this game, try to wear out the defense, and then, hit his guys on some play action. Because I don't think Miami's going to be able to control the time of possession like they would had Tua been under center.
Yeah. Agreed. Going into the rapid round here, we're going to try and wrap these guys up quickly, just give you a little bit of commentary on all these guys. Kirk Cousins is going up against the Saints, so I think he's looked pretty solid as a quarterback, kept Atlanta in games, but against the Saints, they've been so good against opposing quarterbacks so far. They held Jalen Hurts to a bad game. They held, obviously, Bryce Young didn't have a good game against them, but also Dak didn't have a great game. So I think the matchup is a big factor here. Stafford just doesn't have his weapons. Unfortunately, Chicago has been a pretty solid defense as well. Not really allowing Anthony Richardson really to get going last week either. Trevor Lawrence doesn't really take a rocket scientist to realize he is struggling so far. So going up against a Houston team that just got kind of blown out by Minnesota, I think is going to be a tough lift for him.
Yeah, and just to add with Lawrence, if anyone's been listening to us, for the last 6 months, you've just been ripping Trevor Lawrence. He is your least favorite player in the league. You think he's awful, and every call so far about that has been true. And so I know you're probably smiling a little bit being ahead of that because he has just looked lost out there. And Brian Thomas Jr. has looked good too. It's like,
yeah, he's just bad, right? I mean, the first overall pick, generational talent, all this stuff that just gets hyped in the media. Like when you actually watch the games, everybody that watches the games knows he's bad. And he's been okay at quarterback in fantasy because he racked up some rushing yards and he, was able to kind of get things going with Calvin Ridley a little bit. But like he struggled all the way until the end of last 5 weeks last year too, and then kind of started to pick it up. But he overall just way too many turnovers. They don't sustain enough drives. They're so vulnerable to getting blown out. I just don't think he's good at all.
Yeah, I mean, if you've only watched two Trevor Lawrence games in your entire life, and both of those were the national championship game his freshman year and the second half of that playoff game against the Chargers, you probably think he's the best quarterback of all time. But outside of those, he has not looked very good at all. Moving on quickly to Taylor Heineke. Please don't start him against Kansas City. If Herbert is out, this
Don't
is
even
going
add
to be
him.
rough. Yeah, they're just don't save the bench spot. Gardner Minshew, he's got Cleveland this week. Tough defense. Obviously has good weapons, but Aiden O'Connell came in at the end of that game. He looked decent. I know it was garbage time, but maybe we start hearing calls for his name soon. So I wouldn't necessarily be wasting a roster spot on him unless I completely had to. Jacoby Brissett, he's got zero upside whatsoever. He doesn't have good weapons. He's facing off against the Niners, who are pissed after that loss to the Rams. Bo Nix, my least favorite player. He's got a tough matchup against the Jets. He had a good fantasy week. He rushed for quite a bit of yards. He scored on the ground, but he still has not thrown his first touchdown. So anyone that's ready to crown him the next big thing, like just pump the brakes. Let's see him throw up against Sauce Gardner in the Jets. We'll see how he does this week. And then Tim Boyle, that's not even a real name. That's a name of a bar on the south side of Boston. Like, come on, against Tennessee, like we're not starting Tim Boyle unless he just throws screen passes to his playmakers. Like there's zero upside here. I mean, we saw it last week with Skylar Thompson.
Yeah, and look for Boyle. Right, that's the Miami situation. Look for Tyler Huntley this week. Take a peek. I mentioned him yesterday in the waiver ads for SuperFlex leagues, especially deep SuperFlex leagues. See if the practice reports give you any indication on Huntley.